what we're going to do briefly, but this is really briefly, is we're going to both give a brief introduction to ourselves and our journey across disciplines, our journey across our personal and perhaps institutional journeys. And then, of course, we can't talk about education and creativity and challenge without shedding a bit of a spotlight on talking about the COVID situation, which obviously all of us have been living through and living with for at least the last 5 months plus. And I suppose we want to highlight the fact that some of the stuff that COVID has thrown up has been around a really long time. It's just thrown it into starker relief. And then we're going to talk about barriers to change, as well as sparks of hope, sparks of light, opportunities to try and push things forward. And into that debate comes questions around creativity, different forms of voice and expression in education, and sustainability. So I'm going to ask Nicole to kick off first and say something about her journey through education, art, life.
Yeah, thank you, Claire, and thank you, Sean. So I'm an artist. I work predominantly with video, printmaking, and drawing. But my background is quite diverse in the sense that I'm also trained in the physical sciences and chemistry. And I'm also an educator as well. I teach studio arts at Sarah Lawrence College, which is a small liberal arts college just north of New York City, as well as I presently tutor math and chemistry at the high school level. I have extensive experience with pro bono work, working with lower income families. And I also taught 2,000 middle school students in Korea about a decade ago. So my experience with education has sort of hit all levels of society, different nationalities, and even different disciplines. And so for me, my art practice and my teaching practice really have grown together. I don't consider them as separate things. And our present material situation really has brought forth an obvious need for change, with education being one of those things. And so I do want to talk today, yes, about how creativity can both open up what such change can look like, and also why it's needed for a more rigorous assessment of the very problems at hand, as such problems I think have become so familiar to many of us that we don't even think about how it is to sort of formally break those things down. And I do think that the COVID situation has really defamiliarized a lot of that, and I think has inspired the imagination necessary for rigorous assessment. So that's sort of what I have to say for my intro. So Claire, if you want to introduce yourself now.
Thank you. So one of the things that struck me when I first spoke to Nicole is how we both, and I think many people do, go on this rather complex and sometimes windy disciplinary journey. So this is a long time ago now, but I originally did my first degree in Russian and French, and was very fascinated by different cultures, different politics, different ways of living. And that led me into a doctorate in political science when I was looking at the barriers and enablers of change in the Soviet Union, interestingly, at the time of Gorbachev. I hope some of you remember Gorbachev. And that sort of interest in institutions, and I define that very broadly to also encompass cultural norms, is perhaps something that's really informed my work as I moved out of quite a lot of precarious employment into working as an academic developer. And an academic developer is someone who is working to enhance education. Usually it relates to higher education, but not exclusively. And so now I head up, as Sean said, the LSE Eden Centre for Education Enhancement. And basically we're trying to work to make, in one sentence, education better for all our students, no matter where they come from, what their backgrounds are. But actually we work predominantly with members of academic staff in the Eden Centre. We work with them to develop their own practice. We work with them on curriculum enrichment. And we also work in partnership where possible with students, so that students can have voice and can feed into the development of education at our institution. I'm going to just say one final thing before we move on to talk a little bit more concretely about COVID, is that one of the things I feel quite strongly is to be a successful academic developer is a very creative endeavor, because we tend to occupy what you might call liminal spaces in the higher education institution. our role can be contested, our expertise can be contested, and we sort of sit halfway house between the academic world and the professional services world, where we have an institutional remit to deliver, but we also need to retain that voice of criticality, because without that voice of criticality, without what I like to think of as slightly subversive, we're not going to bring about the change that we hope to bring about in terms of really democratizing education and making education something that all students can benefit from. So I think that's enough about me. And obviously, if people have got questions about LSE Eden Centre and any aspect of what we do, I'd be happy to answer them afterwards. We thought we would move on to talk about COVID itself and how life has changed for us as educators during the last 5 or 6 months, because of course most higher education institutions, as you are all well aware, at different points, certainly in the UK, in the second half of March, obviously it was earlier in other countries, in Australia already in January, February, moved online. And this was actually quite a radical departure for my institution, which is overwhelmingly a face-to-face higher education institution. But I'm going to let Nicole speak first about her experience, and then I'll say something more about what happened at LSE and some of the kind of positives that have come out of it, but also some of those inequalities that we really want to shed a spotlight on today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, so again, I teach at Sarah Lawrence, and I think a lot of people were very resistant to teaching online. But the thing that I thought that was really inspiring about this really drastic shift in such a short amount of time was that it showed us that how we teach can actually be quite flexible, far more flexible than people assume we can be effective in sort of any given medium, that usually being the face-to-face way in which we're used to teaching. But I had a very successful switch over to the online format. And I think the key to that is just fully embracing it and not sort of holding too strongly to one's nostalgia about being in person. To do so, I think, then there'll always sort of be this deficit felt. And so I had to completely revamp my courses. I rewrote the curriculum and tried to find, different avenues with which to teach studio arts on an online format. And it was fine. My students made amazing work. And so if any of them are watching right now, they really, really made quite impressive work given the circumstances, the massive amount of change and duress that they underwent. And so, however, that's on a local level, right? So that's my experience with the sort of change in my particular college courses. However, I do feel that COVID has highlighted problems that have already existed. These things aren't new. And this is, at least through the educational lens, is highly reflected in access to high-speed internet, access to devices that can handle this type of teaching and updated software, and even the spaces at home with which they're studying in. I think that these things are not novel, nor should they be considered novel, but just that COVID has brought light to a situation that has existed for a very long time. And it cannot be ignored, even as we have to embrace this sort of new way of teaching for everyone's, safety, general safety. So yeah, Claire, if you want to give your...
I'll come back and say something a little bit about what happened at LSE, and then maybe we can pick up some of that discussion around inequality and change and barriers to change. So I mean, interestingly enough, for all of us, COVID was a disruption to our lives, to our professional lives, to our personal lives. And this was the same for those of us working in university, people studying in university, and of course, across all sorts of domains. And so it was a moment of rupture. And also that rupture, I feel, created some possibility. We had, I work LSE, as those of you who know it, is a reasonably traditional, conservative with the small c institution from a sort of digital point of view. And so we had colleagues who were forced into embracing the digital in a way they would never have done before. So I feel like even though we were trying at first just to replicate what we did normally in a face-to-face teaching and learning setting, we sort of fast forwarded quite a few decades, at least temporarily, which raises questions around sustainability. People rolled up their sleeves and they had a go. and we were able to teach out our second term, which we call LSE, the Lent term, the spring term, Lent term 2019. And we also were able to deliver all our assessments in the summer term online. So that was a massive, in a way, it was a leap of faith, supported by the expertise across the institution, including in my centre. And so I feel like, from a positive point of view, it was that moment of rupture led to some creativity, led to some engagement that we don't normally see. And also it led to it led to sort of collective effort. Quite often, I think there's a very individualized approach to education, the kind of sage on the stage, the kind of academic, having ownership of their course, but actually there are many, many people involved in designing, enabling, delivering a program, and that sort of sudden rupture made that very apparent and opened up these moments of collaboration and creativity. But as Nicole says, I absolutely agree that it also shed a spotlight on all sorts of inequalities that we're aware of, and new inequalities between and among students, some of which Nicole have already spoken about, inequalities across and within different staff bodies. Certainly, the academics occupy the permanent academics, I should say, occupy the privileged spaces in the institutions, and people who support them are seen as playing a secondary role. And I sort of don't agree with the notion of COVID as this great leveler that we're all in it together, because I feel like it's absolutely, people face very different situations. Some students went home, they had their own room, had their own computer, they had high-speed internet. They didn't have to worry too much that there might be issues of surveillance if they were to participate quite openly in discussions around certain things. And that's just one example of where the COVID shed a spotlight on particular inequalities. One of the key questions, and we can perhaps pick this up later, is what happens next. For the last 3 months, I've been really working intensively in what we're calling LSE Curriculum Shift 2020, and that's the initiative to prepare for the new academic year. And so we're trying to encourage our colleagues, we've encouraged our colleagues to move beyond just kind of heavy lifting what they used to do face to face into a digital space, to start thinking more creatively and in a different way about what is effective in terms of learning online, learning at a distance. Next academic year, we're anticipating a mixture. We expect to have quite a few students, a lot of students face-to-face on a socially distanced campus, which demands creativity and a huge amount of work in and of itself, but we will also have students online. So how do we think creatively about enabling all those students to feel part of one community? And also, how do we ensure that those students who are at a distance because they can't get a visa, because they're not well enough to travel, are not seen as being in a deficit model? You can learn really, really well at a distance online, and we really need to shift that mindset to think about nothing's as good as learning face to face, but actually how do we think creatively to enable really effective collective learning online?
Yeah, and I'm curious then how that, because obviously this, as we prepare for dealing with COVID, also, we have, I feel like I would say, an increased discourse around sort of equality, diversity, inclusion. I don't know Claire, if you want to speak to that first, about, because I feel like this is a question that's now being raised quite intensely definitely here in the United States, and if you're feeling that same rise as well in the UK.
Do you want to start and say something about the US, and then I'll follow on in terms of UK?
Sure. So, I mean, I feel like anyone who's watching here, who's from the US, we've had this, COVID has been because it has been calling to light, many problems around that we find in society, as well as colliding with the murder of George Floyd, which happened at the end of May. There has been this increased sort of call for awareness around what we would hear as something like equality, diversity, and inclusivity. in universities. And I, maybe I'll get into then, I really think that a lot of these calls from universities are not enough. And it may sound like enough, but I really don't think it is. And so when we talk about inequality, maybe this is a good place to sort of state this, is that, is it really taking into account what actual material inequality means? Because I think all this language gets sort of tossed around and material reality isn't really addressed in a very concrete way. And so, for instance, Claire, I'll use your school as an example. So I was reading an article in The Guardian in 2017, and the head of admissions was talking about, getting all of their admissions staff trained in implicit bias so that they could more correctly assess those applicants coming from what they sort of quote unquote disadvantaged communities. But what does that really mean? I really don't know that admissions committees, that admin at universities are really taking into consideration like truly what that means. What does it mean to live in a society that's broken down into a system of classes? And so I just want to ground us then and the audience what that truly means, so that we can then assess universities' proposals appropriately. And so classes are large groups of people who differ from one another based upon the place in which they occupy in the society, which is taking part in a process that aims to create all the things that society needs to carry on, right? And so three things must really be taken into consideration. One, what is their relationship to the ownership of all the stuff that's needed for society to carry on? That is, who owns the land, who owns the buildings, the resources, raw materials, modes of transportation, etc. Two, what is their role in the organization of the work which is required for society to carry on? That is, what kind of work is any individual person doing? Is it engaging in manual labor? Is it intellectual labor, etc.? And then three, how much of society's wealth do they have access to, and how is it that exactly do they acquire it, right? So we live in a society that allows for, a person to have to work 3 jobs over 40 hours a week and yet not have enough to feed their family or get access to healthcare, right? So this is materially what we're talking about. That is, what is class? It's a group of people where one group basically can steal the labor of another, and that is the definition of exploitation. And so why can they even do that? It is because of the particular position in society in which they occupy within a definite system of social economy. And so this is what we always have to keep in mind when we're talking about inequality. What does inequality mean? That it's not an abstraction, it is rooted in material reality. And so for myself, when I think about these sort of calls for equality and inclusivity and all that from universities, something like, implicit bias, sort of removing small racism, small sexisms, how can that possibly start to correct for a society that is completely organized around inequality and exploitation? And so I think in order to actually address these things head on, we have to understand education and its place in society at large. And so, Claire, I know you deal with sort of, so I think that there is great resistance within education because there is great resistance to change in society itself. And so I know, Claire, we talked a little bit about this in prior conversations, the very resistance that you feel even within your job, and professors who claim, or admin professors, what have you, who claim they want to have this, inclusive space and what have you, but in practice actually don't exhibit, their words and deeds don't quite align.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot there, and it's and it is absolutely true that universities, certainly I'll speak for the UK, are very focused on sort of agendas around, as you said, EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusivity, and I think that sometimes those types of words are bandied about, but people don't necessarily really genuinely engage in what that means. So there's some tick boxing that institutions may seek to go through, and one of the concerns I have about implicit bias or unconscious bias training is it makes it look nicer than it really is. The reality is that we all need to whether we're educators or admin, as you said, whatever our role in the university is, we need to be willing to engage with our own privilege and the structural racisms or classisms or actually sort of all the anti-ableism that we may or may not, which may be shaping our behaviors. And so what we, in terms of sort of, we're helped a little bit at the moment at in England and Wales, because we have a, even though we don't always like our new regulator, the Office for Students, it's not very nice having a what might turn into a very heavy-handed regulator. What they have said to the higher education sector, which gives us an instrument that we can use, is that they need to close their attainment gaps. And when we talk about attainment gaps, we're talking about gaps in achievement. They're really degree awarding gaps, but across the whole life cycle of education, entry into higher education. And of course, anyone who's been in the UK for the last week will know that the initial round of A-level results were seen to have disadvantaged students from poorer socioeconomic backgrounds. So we see already that the risk of, if we'd gone ahead with those, attainment gaps in terms of access would have been multiplied as a result of those A-levels. So we're talking about entry into higher education, staying in higher education. Why are there higher dropout rates, for example, in quite a few universities among Black and minority ethnic students in England and Wales? Attainment, so degree awarding gaps, and then entry out into progression out into the world of work. And at all those different levels, we see that there are structural barriers at play, which before you've even kind of walked through the door, mean that if you come from, in this case, for the Office for Students, a Black and minority ethnic background, depending on your university, and you obviously the data differs across the sector, but you're at a disadvantage before you've walked through the door. So I feel strangely that we have a bit of an instrument which we can use to try and engender some genuine change. But as Nicole said, that there is resistance. So I think that personally, and this relates to work around inclusivity, work around genuinely trying to bring about change. It also relates to the education work I do in general. There are those who are genuinely engaged and really trying to, grapple with difficult questions, feel discomfort, learn and develop. There are those who are at the other end of the spectrum who are totally resistant and who just don't even want to have the discussion. And that might be for a range of different reasons. They feel they've got nothing to learn. They feel that the reward and recognition structures of the institution push them to focus on research output and a particular form of knowledge creation. And then there are those in the middle, and in some ways those are the most interesting category, because they probably think they're open to change, and they are open to change, but we need to ask questions about how far are you willing to go, because as Nicole said, one of the universities, and I do think universities will struggle to meet their targets around these access and participation plans, because universities don't exist in a vacuum. They exist within society, and so if there's resistance, and so it's not surprising that you meet those pockets of resistance inside an institution when the surrounding society is privileging particular groups in a particular way. So I think there's issues around how much change do people really want to take on board, and then I think there are issues around, and what are the incentive structures in which we're operating? What do they privilege? Do they privilege colleagues investing in developing truly inclusive approaches to education and transformative education, so that as you go through that process of higher education, you have that opportunity, that you have some time and some space to really grow and develop and perhaps even change your worldview? Or do the incentive structures actually push you to undervalue that aspect of your work and focus on your research output? And I know, Nicole, you've experienced some of that in your own journey as well.
Yeah, I think that's really important to understand too, that institutions of education spring from, again, the very society that is based upon inequality. And so actually it's funny, because I was reading about the A-levels. Sorry, it's different here in the US. And that it's interesting that in thinking about this idea of reflection of society in education. So luckily it was abandoned, but the original proposal, for those who aren't in the UK right now, was to basically give grades for a test that wasn't taken by the students using an algorithm that took into account their physical location. And so what does that do? It actually takes into account the general class makeup of one school, in then assigning a grade, an algorithm based calculated grade for a test that they never took. And so it's interesting, as soon as that reflection becomes that much more one-to-one, the students were outraged, right? There were massive, I was reading about massive protests of high school students, because they could start to see more clearly how it was is that the very inequities of society were directly reflected then in education. And so that's why I do, on the one hand, yes, of course, one's personal bias must be taken into account, but to show that enough is not alone, right? What we're seeing is massive structures of inequality that are then simply reflected in the way in which education is run as a whole. It's not just one racist admissions officer or, one professor who's, sexist in the classroom. It's not enough to just sort of put these band-aids on education, that it really does require, and this is where I think the creativity aspect comes in, that it requires great imagination to imagine not just, education being run differently, but our entire society. I really think that if one is going to be invested in the idea of equality, in making that become a reality, that one's imagination must be pushed to its absolute extreme in order to, completely, it's easy to just want to slap a Band-Aid on something. For my own school, I will criticize it, with the racial protests and Black Lives Matter, I get an email saying oh, everyone contribute, 2 Black authors or 2 non-white artists so that we can decolonize our syllabus. And I'm sorry, that is not in any way materially significant in fighting state oppression against Black people in the United States. What does that do? Nothing. And yet educators like to think that they're doing a good job. And they must really take into account the larger picture of things and being really quite honest about their role and what they can do in the limits of their own imagination for what change could actually look like. It's going to take more than simply rearranging one syllabus to change the world. It's going to require real work and sacrifice, and as I said, imagination.
I think that's incredibly important, and I think another dimension of that, and to me that has really been, again, really emphasised, underlined by the whole COVID situation, is that also education is care, education is empathy, and to really have a sort of transformative effect on our students, with our students, we can't separate out what they're learning and experiencing in the classroom to what they're experiencing in the wider world. And so we thought that, because I don't know exactly how much time we've got left, Sean, but we thought that while sort of recognizing that there are these sort of huge structural societal questions in which education is embedded, and that if we really want to achieve true transformation, society needs to change as well as the way we think about education. But we thought we might sort of say a couple of things about some exciting transformative work that has been underway, but recognizing that those barriers are still very much at play. So Nicole, I thought we might say something about your dark study project, because it's really exciting, and then I'm going to say something about a couple of projects that we're involved with at LSE that I think people might like to hear about.
Yeah, I'm involved in now, I would say, a couple projects, independent projects around education, in working outside of the institution, sort of officially outside the institution. One is I have been working since COVID started, well, actually I've been working on this for the past year, is rewriting Marx's Capital to become more accessible for people. And I now have students sort of across 4 continents and, using the internet. It's kind of amazing being able to teach this economics text and trying to get it into a shape and form that's more accessible to people, shaping it based upon teaching. So that was sort of my first foray into really taking on a larger educational project that is not supported by an institution. And then a collaborative endeavor that's more art focused with artist Caitlin Cherry and writer Nora Khan, where we're working on this project called Dark Study, and trying to rethink what education and discourse in the arts looks like, by we're trying to revamp everything. So it is a lot of work. Rethinking how to make education accessible to people. We're aiming to, for this first year of our undertaking, to allow this thing to be free. We're trying very hard to figure out how to make that happen. And we're also looking to see how it is that we can start to address class in the very application system, so that we can, serve students who have been deeply alienated from the general university system, and not just simply replicating the very structures in which universities have given sort of access to those few who, because of their position in society, they have access to all of the things. And, we recognize that while, we don't have all the answers yet, but it requires a lot of imagination and hard work to, we really want to revamp all of it. Everything is under question right now. And so, we think that we're very excited, and we've garnered a lot of excitement from other people. And we're hoping that this can be just the start of trying to work on this really large problem. And so, yeah, and like I said, it is a lot of work.
Really exciting. I think we need to acknowledge that change takes work, change takes engagement, change takes struggle. And I think that's really important to underline, that if we really want to bring about true change in the university, it's a collective endeavor. It needs to involve everybody, and it takes hard work. So I thought that, knowing we don't have too much time left, maybe I'll say something about a really exciting project we introduced at LSE 2 years ago, which is called the LSE Changemakers. And really, this is all about trying to work in partnership with students. We fund students because students need to live. So we fund them to undertake research-based projects around education in the institution, with the aim that they will come up with action-oriented recommendations to make life better at the institution for everyone. And we've just had the most amazing response from our students. So they've looked at inclusion plans for disabled students. They've done some work. There've been some projects looking at decolonizing the curriculum. They've done some really interesting work about food on campus, which, LSE is actually, within the UK, the most international higher education institution in the UK, although we're not expecting to have so many international students next year for understandable reasons. And one of the things they found out was that that food on campus was just as expensive, if not more expensive, than the cafes and shops selling food in the neighborhood, which really doesn't help in terms of building community. And I think that they are inspiring a bit of a sea change in the institution, because the change makers, and we've worked really hard to sort of for them to become known across the institution, are inspiring some members of faculty to think differently about who the students are, how important their voice is in the institution, and how we need to work with them if we really are going to change things. So I think that that's one really exciting development. There are many others, but I'm mindful of time, so I think I'll leave it there. I suppose that what I really wanted to say, in conclusion, is that while I think, I'll speak for myself and then Nicole can speak for herself, there are very real barriers for change. There are possibilities, and in a way, the COVID situation does open up those possibilities, because we've all been we've all been thrown up in the air, and we can't, for the time being, we're having to think about doing things slightly differently. And so that does open up the possibility for new interactions in new digital spaces, thinking about different groupings of students and staff, thinking about new ways to learn, and also new ways to assess. We can't bring students into exam theatres and get them to take time-limited exams. So we can think creatively about other ways to assess them, which are more in line with what they've learned, what they're learning, the journey they've been on, and who they want to be in society. And we can also take on board the emotional, creative sides of learning better, if we capitalize on the situation we're in now. And so really, for me, one of the biggest questions is, what happens, and it's not going to happen for a long time yet, or at least not for a number of months, if not the whole academic year. What will happen when we get back on campus? Will we be changed forever? Or will those old structures of sort of power and resistance rear up and take us and try and pull us back to where we were coming from 5 or 6 months ago?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I guess time will tell. And I think that, you know, if one claims to be truly invested in change, it will require effort, imagination, and really thinking about the stakes involved, right? If, you know, if all you think you have to do is rearrange some things in your curriculum and that's enough, I would, you know, ask you to reconsider the sort of any kind of self-congratulatory feelings one may have about their participation in change, because it is, it's a struggle. And if it's not feeling like a struggle, then I think that educators should rethink how it is that they think that they are participating in such change, not just within education, but also at a greater scope of society. So.
Well, fantastic. I think then time's up a little bit over there, but I think every word there was very much worth every minute, and some very interesting points coming out there within the barriers that we work within, and how creativity can hopefully help not only navigate them but also break free of them. I thought it was particularly interesting, as you were both saying at the end, you know, this is a time for creativity, but also to realize that if it's too easy, if it's not feeling difficult, then something is also wrong within that, and the relationship between the classroom and wider society, of one being a reflection for the other, perhaps there is a growing strength and a growing bond within that in these times. So thank you both very much for that. If anyone has any questions at all, please do drop them into the group chat, which you should all have access to, I hope. I don't see anyone popping up at the moment, but that's absolutely fine. So we are recording all of these videos, and we'll be making them available on both the LSE Generate site and also the Aspect site as well, and obviously with Nicole, share with her networking page also. And we have more talks coming up, so, you know, please do stay tuned. Not today, but on Thursday as well, where we're going to be looking at pollution and the contexts that inform us on that, the politics of air, as the artist Joseph Nellymarker, who will be talking, says, and what motivates our choices within that. So once again, thank you all very much for joining us today. It was very insightful, and I look forward to continuing with you further.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of day wherever you are. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.